You've been watching our live coverage here on Fox 5 and streaming on Fox Local of the arrival of former President Jimmy Carter to Dobbins Air Reserve Base on board Special Air Mission 39, having left Atlanta this morning. The president's remains have just deplaned and were carried into the hearse, where he'll now move into our nation's capital.
Yeah, this moment was, again, very ceremonial in nature, with the military body bearer team removing the casket from the aircraft loader, followed by the U.S. Air Force Band playing Abide With Me, and the body bearer team marching the casket from the plane to the hearse here at Joint Base Andrews, with dozens of members of President Carter's family watching quietly. Just another just reverent moment as we are again witnessing history. From here, the motorcade will depart to the Navy Memorial, a critical part of this plan, as the former president graduated from the Naval Academy and was a member of the U.S. Navy. Important to make a stop at the Navy Memorial before making its way to the U.S. Capitol.
And so the president returning to a place that he called home on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue as the 39th president of the United States. A volatile time to be president, a volatile time in our nation's history, and geopolitically as well. Not the easiest term as president. Many historians would argue that his post-presidency was more impactful and significant following his years in Washington, D.C. But the hearse will now leave Joint Base Andrews, head to the U.S. Navy Memorial, and there will be a transfer service there and a processional up to the United States Capitol. That's all going to happen within the next 45 minutes.
That sure is correct. It has been a long day for the family, being a part of this process, from leaving the Carter Center this morning during the late morning hours up until this point, flying here to D.C. to again begin the process and the continuation of the state funeral, where the former president will eventually be lying in state for just a few hours. It will not be for the same length of time that we saw here in Atlanta for the multiple days and throughout the overnight hours. President Carter will lie in state from 7 p.m. until midnight. But again, very this has been planned for decades now, this process, what this will look like. Jimmy Carter, all the presidents who have succeeded him at this point have not served in the military. So I think we're seeing so many of these military elements in this plan that are so significant to him and so important to him to have served our country militarily.
Just couldn't be a more spectacular day. Up in our nation's capital. We're watching here as the hearse prepares to pull off the grounds of Joint Base Andrews and make its way into Washington, D.C. The city and the surrounding area blanketed in white after a snowstorm came through yesterday, providing what has really been a spectacular backdrop for the arrival of Special Air Mission 39 as it landed there. Joint Base Andrews and the president's casket was taken off of the plane, put into the hearse for this transfer ceremony that's going to happen. And in the preceding days, the funeral service at the National Cathedral. So our Russ Spencer was live with us just a while ago, just describing what a perfect day it is. Chilly, albeit. But beautiful.
We'd like to bring in a guest that we have on set with us, Hubert Davis. He served as the Assistant Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Carter administration. Mr. Davis, thank you for joining us on this day.
Glad to be here.
Would love to get your reflection from what we have not only seen here today, but in the days preceding this, just the outpouring of support and reverence for your former boss, the 39th President of the United States.
Well, it's been amazing to me how well prepared they were for such an important event. And I'm delighted that so many people in Atlanta and in Georgia had a chance to pay their respects to him before the ultimate burial. He was a great person. I think that's been stated over and over again. And working with him, I can only say that he was a great guy to work for. And he always respected your effort. And even if you got it wrong, he really appreciated what you did. So I was honored to have been associated with him, and I really consider it one of the highlights of my life.
I'm just interested in your thoughts watching the coverage this afternoon and your reflections, Mr. Davis, on your memories as OMB director, being a cabinet member, sitting across the desk from President Carter in the Oval Office, meetings that you've been having about the economy and the machinations of government, and here we're watching this momentous occasion. What is going through your head in terms of memories of Jimmy Carter?
Well, he was a detail man, and that troubled some people. As a Georgia Tech person myself, I like details, and I like the fact that people make that kind of effort to understand what's really going on, not just superficially. So he was very good to work for and good to work with. Oftentimes, he would add comments to people's recommendations, suggesting even more of this or more of that. So he was not passive in any way. He was an active president when he was president, and he knew what was going on inside and outside the government. And I think part of what people appreciate is he was straightforward and honest. And if he ever did anything that he felt like needed to be corrected, he corrected it.
Was he a misunderstood man? In other words, he did not win re-election. That came as a devastating blow, not only to President Carter, but to Rosalind as well. President Reagan won the election and swept the Carters out of office and out of Washington. But was he misunderstood, not only from the American people's standpoint, but does history have anything about the former president wrong?
Well, I think those that say he had a presidency that did not succeed as much as people might have expected, they're wrong. He did so much. We got more legislation passed and approved by the Congress than people recognize. Something like 75% of what we put forward was ultimately approved. He was a well-established environmentalist before he got there, and he continued pushing forward ideas and plans to make America even cleaner than it was then. And to this day, many of the things he set out to do have become accepted. Solar energy being one of them. He was early to the solar energy market. Now you're right all over the state of Georgia. You see solar energy farms everywhere, generating clean energy for the population. So he was a person well ahead of his time in many instances.
Do you have a lasting memory? Of course, we saw the former president in his latter years very frail, very fragile. Is there a lasting memory that you particularly hold on to, whether on a personal note or through your service of his administration when he was in office? Well,
he was a very active person. He played a lot of tennis. He jogged way much more than people realize, particularly in the weekends at Camp David. He loved to play baseball and softball. He loved to go to the Braves games. he was a sports fan. He did a lot of sports.
You told us while we were watching the coverage of the arrival of President Carter back to Joint Base Andrews that the last time you spoke to him was not at Rosalind's funeral. He was rather incapacitated there, but on their anniversary day. What was that conversation like not too long ago?
It was just, hello, how are you? Hope you're feeling better than you did the last time. He was very, I always had that grin, and which I always appreciated. So he was an easy guy to work with and be around at all times, whether it was towards the end or whether it was in the middle.
Yeah. You intend on, you plan on attending the funeral in Plains, is that correct?
I don't know yet. Depends on this weather. We've got some bad weather coming in, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think people should remember most about your former boss?
What an honest person he was, what a hard-working person he was, how much he cared about the United States of America and the world at large, how much he cared about the least successful people, whether they be in the United States or in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So I just thought he was as good as you get. My neighbor used to say that if you want to be close to Jesus, just stand next to Jimmy Carter. Mm. That was my neighbors who didn't vote for him, by the way.
I'm interested. You held this important office of management and budget director. Jimmy Carter has been described so many times as such a deeply faithful man, a gentle man, a faithful man. Washington is not necessarily a friendly place to be and operate. In fact, if you're like what Jimmy Carter is described as, you can be a real fish out of water up there. How did he reconcile being all the things we know about Jimmy Carter to be versus the bloodbath that Washington, D.C. can often be?
He was the same all the time. He was not a political Christian, if you will. He was an active Christian his entire life, and he lived those values and standards when he was in the White House, and he didn't care who knew it. If people felt like he was a little too religious, so be it. He was the way he was. Went to church every Sunday at a Baptist church in downtown D.C. and had religious leaders of all sorts visit him while he was in the White House, and meet with others. He was a person that what you saw is what you got.
We talk about how disappointing it was for him and how much of a blow it was to not be reelected. Do you ultimately believe that this was his fate, his humanitarian efforts, the decades later that surpassed his presidency, and the huge impact he and Rosalind and Carter and the Carter Center has had globally?
Well, I thought he did a great job as president, so I'm biased. But his post-presidency was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I was involved with it from the time the Carter Center was proposed, and continued to stay involved and supported it every way I can. I think it's amazing that you've got a former president of the United States who hosts Sunday school classes in his hometown church every Sunday. For anyone who can walk up and walk in the door is welcome to attend. I just think that's amazing that he goes out for a week every year to build Habitat for Humanity houses, and encourages others to do so. And the number of houses built as a result of Carter and the other people who he brought aboard is astonishing and very helpful in this day and time when housing is so expensive.
Yeah. I mean, it just underscores what you said. He was a Christian, but he lived it and he walked it and he talked it.
As we watch these live pictures together of the former president making his way into the nation's capital, did the Carters, from your vantage point, enjoy life in the White House and in Washington, D.C.?
To the extent I know, they certainly did. I mean, what's not to like? It was a great place, and they took full advantage of it. They were very social in the proper sort of way. They had private visitors come. They had state dinners. They had congressional dinners. They had congressional Christmas parties. They had 4th of July fireworks. It was a busy place.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary about how his association just with the music of that time and all these different artists that he would bring into the White House. Talk about how that was important for him to socialize with people who may not look like you or have the same background as you.
Well, the rock and roll president, as he's often called by some folks, fitted him well because he was a musician, or an appreciation of music, of all types of music. It seemed to me like one of the things that helped in the campaign in '76 was the musicians, because he had this sort of image of being a super Christian, etc. And they sort of helped settle, not disabuse anyone of that thought, but help see he's a well-rounded person. He's not just one way. I think that the music and the people in the music community helped him a lot, and I'm grateful that they did.
The Carters and their life in Washington, D.C. President Carter, at least as far as history is concerned, and his relationship with former presidents, I wouldn't say that was a natural or a comfortable fit for him, perhaps because he was a political outsider. Would you say that is sort of how his administration operated in D.C.? He was a political outsider. He wasn't a creature of the Washington establishment. That manifested itself also in his post-presidency, according to historians, with his relationship with even Democratic presidents like Bill Clinton and the others, when they would not frequently but have the chance to reunite.
He was a politician because you can't be president without being a politician, but politics, being a politician, was not as important as getting it right. And he made a great effort to not let politics get in the way of accomplishing things, but at the same time he didn't like for politics to drive decisions. So if you went to him and you said, this is good for you politically, he would say, well, let's find another alternative. He was just not a traditional politician, which a lot of people like, me included. I felt like that we needed a fresh air in Washington, and I think he provided that, and it was very helpful in moving the country forward during the 4 years he was there.
You were watching live pictures of the motorcade making its way from Joint Base Andrews to the Navy Memorial at this moment. You see all the snow on the ground there in D.C. From what I understand, officials there in D.C. Worked very hard to make sure roads were clear and there would be sufficient access for the motorcade to make its way from Joint Base Andrews to the Navy Memorial, then eventually the U.S. Capitol. So it seems like this drive so far has been without issue and pretty seamless. We have teams on the ground, including our Russ Spencer and Tyler Fingert there in D.C.
I want to thank Office of Management and Budget Director for the Carter administration, Hubert Harris, for offering his invaluable perspective about what the Carter presidency and the man himself were like during those 4 years in our nation's capital. Speaking of, let's get out to Fox 5's Tyler Fingert, who's standing by live in D.C. Tyler, we've been watching this transfer ceremony happen today, deplaning from Special Air Mission 39, now on his way to the U.S. Navy Memorial.
Yeah, Tom, good afternoon to you. And you were saying this a little earlier, it must be emotional for the family having to see his casket at the Carter Center, then Dobbins Air Force Base, then Joint Base Andrews, and now that motorcade coming here. His first stop in Washington, D.C., going to be the Navy Memorial. And those chopper pictures we were showing just a couple of moments ago, really striking. Just you see the snow on both sides of the road as it's going. It just truly, personally, a mesmerizing sight. And he is making his way here. We're expecting his motorcade to arrive at about 3:25 or so is what the latest update we heard just within the last about 15 minutes. And that first stop here is going to be the Navy Memorial. Let me step out of the way. So that transfer from the hearse to the horse-drawn caisson will happen pretty much right in front of us, right here at the Navy Memorial. And obviously, this spot was chosen on purpose because former President Carter is a Navy veteran, having served 15 years in both active duty and the reserves. And an interesting note, the Navy Memorial was approved by Congress in 1980 and then was signed into law by Mr. Carter. And so when the motorcade arrives, there will be two formations of midshipmen from the Navy Academy, or the Naval Academy rather, President Carter's alma mater. And then there will be another brief ceremony here that we're expecting to last about anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes or so, possibly a little bit longer. Then he'll be moved into a horse-drawn caisson, which is a ceremonial wagon, which will take him the final roughly mile to the east front of the Capitol. And that journey is obviously going to be with a lot of different folks lining the route. You can see from just off in the distance, there are hundreds of Americans who have come out here to take in the sight of this procession that is expected, this funeral procession that will start sometime around 3:30 this afternoon. And more people are continuing to show up. And it won't just be people and Americans lining the route here on Pennsylvania Avenue as it makes its way to Capitol Hill. There will also be service members from every branch of the military lining the route as well as they pay respects to a former commander-in-chief. This is obviously the first of many ceremonies that are going to happen here in our nation's capital. He was president for 4 years from Georgia, and this is his, obviously, state funeral and goodbye for all that he did for not only Georgia and our country. And so it will be incredibly moving to see over the next few days as this country says goodbye to former President Jimmy Carter. And obviously for us, he is a Georgian. We know him well, serving our state as governor, and all of the different things he did over the course of his time here in Washington. And so we're being told right now, I just heard from one of the media representatives here, he is 1 mile out, and so that likely is our 10-minute warning. And it's at that point he will, that ceremony where he will move from the hearse, the casket will move from the hearse into the caisson, will end up being a unfolding here. Christine, Tom?
And quickly, Tyler, we'll ask you, because we know once the motorcade arrives, they're asking the media not to speak. I remember when the body of the former president arrived to the Georgia Capitol, how it was like you can hear a pin drop around the area. Are you feeling that similar sense there at the Navy Memorial, seeing members of the public now lining the streets?
Yeah, for the members of the public who are lining the streets, they're probably maybe 100 or so yards from where we're standing right now, many of them standing on a hill just off in the distance. And I'm sure they're going to feel the same way as when former President Jimmy Carter's casket was moved in Georgia. It's the same thing. This is a former president. He deserves the respect from his time in office and for all he did for our country as a Navy veteran, and then as Georgia governor and also a commander-in-chief. And you're taking a live look from that motorcade right now on your screen. These are live pictures coming from that hearse that is making its way here to the U.S. Navy Memorial on Pennsylvania Avenue, which will be the first of many ceremonies here in our nation's capital over the course of the next several days, where eventually he'll be lying in state tonight at the U.S. Capitol, and then eventually having his state funeral on Thursday.
I'm not mistaken, Tyler, we're watching these live pictures with you as you talk about what's happening here. This is the George Washington Parkway that the late president is now making his way up. I'm wondering, we understand that the casket transfer ceremony is going to include the transfer of Carter's remains from the hearse to the horse-drawn caisson. Is that within your eye shot there? And if so, can you show us how that is being set up?
From where we are currently, we don't really see that horse-drawn caisson at this moment, but there are some military members and service members moving into place. I believe those to be the midshipmen from the Naval Academy moving into place. Again, the two formations expected to be here to greet the former president and his family, and people are beginning to get into place, considering he is approaching here in that procession, or that motorcade here, so that they can begin that funeral procession here at the U.S. Navy Memorial and make its way to the Capitol, on the east front of the Capitol, which is where it will end. And there will be another brief ceremony over there where he'll then go in. But at this point, I do not see, and I believe we do see a motorcade going. So out of respect, we are going to take a brief pause, at least for myself, and I'll send it back to Tom and Christine.
All right, Tyler Fingert there, U.S. Navy Memorial, where we're expecting the remains of former President Carter at any moment. We've been watching that processional from Joint Base Andrews to this area where his remains will now be transferred to that horse-drawn caisson.
And we're seeing the formation now of the midshipmen from the Naval Academy who are flanking the memorial here. We understand the Secretary of the Navy is also in attendance here, as well as the Honorable Carlos Del Toro and Superintendent of the Naval Academy, Vice Admiral Yvette M. Davids in attendance for this moment.
Bring in Fox 5 anchor Russ Spencer, who's leading our coverage from Washington, D.C. Russ, just such a profound set of events that have transpired just over the past hour as we take a live look at that horse-drawn caisson that I was asking Tyler if he could see from his vantage point. Now we do see it coming up Pennsylvania Avenue, where the former president's remains are going to be transferred to. What are some of your thoughts as we witness this significant day?
Well, I'm thinking about the Carter family and how emotional this must be for them. The former president went into hospice care almost 2 years ago. And at that time, I had many conversations with his grandson, Jason, who told me they expected him to potentially go at any moment. But when it happens, it's hard, even if it's something that you're expecting. I heard your conversation with Carter OMB director, Mr. Harris, talking about how he and the former president were Georgia Tech guys, detail guys. And I'm also struck as I look at this, Tom and Christine, at the precision of the military in honoring President Carter, both at Joint Base Andrews and now here. There's a lot of love of country and honor and duty that goes into this, to doing what they do so precisely well. It's very well practiced, and there's a lot of heart in it as well. So the scene that we're looking at there with the caisson, the horse-drawn caisson, that's about a mile from the Capitol that I'm standing near, and it will come down Pennsylvania Avenue. He went the other direction after his inauguration in 1977 from the Capitol to the White House. And I can hear the sirens now off in the distance from here in the Capitol. So let's just watch this unfold. Eventually they will make their way down here, and I think I'll be able to show you some of that procession from our vantage point here near the Capitol. But let's just watch this. By all appearances, President Carter's casket getting much closer now to the Navy Memorial, about a mile from the U.S. Capitol. Navy midshipmen are preparing to receive his casket, to treat him with the ultimate respect. Of course, President Carter graduated from the Naval Academy in 1946, was a favorite of Admiral Rickover and had been chosen for submarine duty, some of the first nuclear submarines. And he was on his way to being a Navy officer, a high-ranking Navy officer, when his father died in 1953, and he was required back in planes. And as fate would have it, that move laid the groundwork for his political career and ultimately his ascent to the presidency. Very interesting. I spoke to Senator Warnock this afternoon, and he said that he agrees with President Carter, who said during his Nobel lecture that he would not have been president of the United States were it not for the successes of the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. Because people didn't know whether they could trust a guy from the South like Jimmy Carter. Now, apparently, President Carter and MLK Jr. didn't meet, but Daddy King, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, vouched for Jimmy Carter, and President Carter never forgot it and gave ultimate credit to them for his success in taking his political career past Georgia and to the presidency. Of course, just one term, but a very consequential term, something that we are paying respect to today. Certainly moving to see military members there gathered in salute. And it won't be long now before the former president's body is transferred from the hearse to that caisson. I feel like I've seen pictures. I was 2 years old when John F. Kennedy was tragically assassinated, so I don't remember it from seeing it happen in my childhood, but in the history books I believe I've seen a caisson much like that, and his son John saluting that caisson after his assassination. This is a tradition that goes back a long, long way. As I think I mentioned earlier in this broadcast, right now at the U.S. Capitol behind me, there is a platform called a catafalque, if I'm not mistaken. It's essentially the platform on which they will place the president's casket, and it's the same one that was used to support the casket of Abraham Lincoln when he was assassinated in 1865. So there's lots of tradition, lots of respect on this day, lots of reverence in this town, and a real sense of quiet too. You know how you go outside after a heavy snowfall and somehow that snow absorbs some of the sound. Of course, there's a natural silence because of people's reverence, but that's an added element to the reverence today, Tom and Christine, that they couldn't have been planned. This ceremony, this observance has been planned for years and years and years, and is finally coming to fruition in a way that I think is more impactful than they could have hoped.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Russ, Washington D.C. is very, very good at carrying out such significant ceremonies like this one that have been played out a handful of times before with former presidents, Ford, Nixon, Reagan, George H.W. Bush most recently. And so, like an inauguration in many ways, which is just 2 weeks away now, this too is part of a ritual in Washington that has been refined over the decades in that city, and it's just so perfectly executed in the way everything happens. You were talking about former President Carter's time as a naval officer, and that manifested in his presidency in the strengthening of the armed forces, the defense budgets, his involvement with NATO and the SALT treaties, and establishing the Department of Energy, which kind of fed off his time on board that nuclear sub, and the proliferation of those kinds of arms during that era as we're getting closer to this transfer ceremony.
Oh, you're exactly right, Tom. I think some people might be surprised at the details, at how much President Carter invested in our military, invested in defense and materiel after there had been some cutbacks after Vietnam. And some of that came in handy for President Reagan as he took on the Soviets in the following decade.
And so our coverage continues here as we bring you these live pictures in front of the U.S. Navy Memorial, right in the heart of our nation's capital and very, very close to the Capitol building itself. And in just a couple of moments, you see the motorcade there has stopped in front of that caisson. We're going to see the transfer of the president.
And it's going to be quite the moment. We're going to continue to watch and listen silently as, again, the midshipmen are in formation, ready to receive as the casket of the former president. And we'll hear multiple songs played by the U.S. Navy Band, who we just a moment ago saw there, Four Ruffles and Flourishes. We'll hear Hail to the Chief. We'll hear a hymn, Just As I Am, and also Without One Plea. So in each moment that we've seen the ceremonial efforts here, it's not without song. Song significant to the former president, especially when you look to the hymns that were chosen for some of these moments.
And in just a short amount of time here, we're also going to hear the clip-clop of the horses' hooves on Pennsylvania Avenue, which will be quite profound as the remains of former President Jimmy Carter, our 39th president and the favorite son of our state here in Georgia, are brought up to the United States Capitol, where the president will lie in state and well-wishers and honorees will be able to file past his casket the same way they did here in Atlanta when he lied in repose at his beloved Carter Center.
And it was just amazing to hear people's stories, why they wanted to come and see him lie in repose, why they wanted to be along the sides of the streets to watch his motorcade pass by, and the various backgrounds of people who came out to see him, black, white, young, old. I mean, it runs the gamut. We spoke to people who came from out of state, who came from Tennessee, just to witness the moments here in Georgia and in Atlanta. And we've already seen people, the public, starting to file along the streets here at the Naval Academy to watch the transfer of the former president's hearse, former president's casket from the hearse to eventually the caisson.
It was the riderless horse, I believe, which will follow the caisson as it makes its way to the Capitol. I thought especially poignant, Christine, you mentioned the people here in Atlanta who took the time out to visit the Carter Center on what was such a blustery day, freezing temperatures outside. So many of them brought their children who might have had no idea who Jimmy Carter was, but to their parents had such a profound impact that they decided to share that moment in history with their children and let them witness the passing of such a profound and prolific man.
Well, not everyone can say they live in a state where a former president was from. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, if you think about it, to be able to say or to be able to go to the Carter Center like a lot of people did, 23,000 did, and to walk past the casket of a former president. So yes, it's remarkable to see how adults alike felt it was important for their children to understand this moment.
The day in Washington, D.C. has provided perfect weather today for the ceremony. There is snow covering the grounds of the National Mall and the United States Capitol. There was a snow-covered airfield at Joint Base Andrews as Special Air Mission 39 touched down after it departed Atlanta this morning on its way up to D.C. For former President Jimmy Carter's funeral today. The streets wet with snow melt as the sun starts to reflect there on the tarmac in what we anticipate to be quite a moving event that's about to transpire. You can see the media there and the steps of the U.S. Navy Memorial ready to give us that view of the transfer of the former president's remains.
And from all accounts, things to really have gone off without a hitch, quite frankly, that we've seen. And it's, again, remarkable to see the efforts. You just imagine the level of security that has to be put in place for something like this to make sure streets are secure, people are safe, the public is safe. Members of the Carter family are safe through this process, and really just impressed.
On that note, Russ Spencer, we talked about it earlier. We have this confluence, speaking of security, of events transpiring up where you are in D.C. With the inauguration, the reconvening of Congress, and now the funeral for a president, all sort of happening within the same time frame of each other.
Yeah. It is an extraordinarily busy time in Washington, D.C. There's no question about that. And yet there is a hush over the city this afternoon because of the reverence surrounding these proceedings. And it is because of his faith a religious moment for a lot of the folks who are assembled here, and certainly for his family. Christine, you mentioned the hymns associated with this, and I was watching your coverage over the weekend at the Carter Center when his body arrived, when his casket arrived at the Carter Center, and he chose one of my favorite hymns, Be Thou My Vision, and you pointed this out, and I think it's worth repeating some of the lyrics associated with that, how fitting it is for the life that he lived. One of the lyrics reads, "Riches I heed not, nor vain, empty praise, Thou mine inheritance, now and always." He was guided by his faith, by his love of God, by what he considered to be God's expectations for his entire life. And when it came to riches, he lived in the same house that he and Rosalind built in 1961. It was a perfectly nice house, but the family would tease him that, hey, maybe we ought to get a new microwave that doesn't tick when you turn it to the right. And he's like, why would I do that? This one works just fine. I spoke to Senator Warnock today, and he said he met recently in Plains with Rosalind before she passed, and Jimmy, and was impressed by their prayerfulness and also by the chair that he had in his office. He said it looked like it was 40 years old, but it was good enough that the purpose was the life that he was going to lead. And even those who don't agree with him politically, who didn't agree with him politically, there wasn't one person that I've heard that said that he didn't honor his pledge never to tell a lie to the American people. Let's listen in as the motorcade begins to move.
Marked on. There's. Oh. Hey. Look on. Ready? Stop. Right. March. Reset! Order! Right, Sunday! Up. Ready. Down. Ready. Step. Set. Ready. Pace. Lock on. Up about. More. Ready. Step.
The casket of former President Carter making its way from the Navy Memorial down to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state later on this evening, and the public will begin to pay its respects at 7 o'clock. Before that, lawmakers will gather for a service here at the U.S. Capitol at 4:30. Very much a family affair for the Carters. We saw the extended family there, including his son Chip, who spoke at the Carter Center over the weekend, and recalled that in his adulthood he took over the farm and became friends with his parents, something that he said he would always cherish. When his father was in the White House, he said he had to make an appointment to see him, and that there was sacrifice for all of them, coming to a culmination now with this national showing of respect for their father and his extraordinary life, his extraordinary 100 years, a record, as we've said so often, for a U.S. president. We also saw Jason Carter, his grandson, who will deliver a eulogy on Thursday at the National Cathedral along with President Biden. He spoke at the Carter Center on Saturday as well, as he also did when his grandmother Rosalind died, said he had as powerful a life as any could be, and got some laughs from the crowd when he said it's amazing what you can cram into 100 years. He really certainly did fill it up, particularly the last 44 years traveling around the world, taking care of the least of these. Who had heard of guinea worm before Jimmy Carter in the United States? And yet it afflicted millions upon millions of Africans in the most remote communities where you couldn't just fly in, you had to hike in some cases. And now guinea worm is all but eradicated, thanks to that man and the people who supported his vision. Christine, Tom?
Russ, the day is getting long in Washington, D.C. We saw the sun kind of creeping behind the buildings there. The shadows on the late afternoon are starting to settle in there. It's 32 degrees in Washington, D.C. at last check. There is a little bit of a blustery wind there as well. So it's a cold afternoon. This processional, we understand, is to mirror, except in the opposite direction, the walk that President Carter established on Inauguration Day between he and Rosalind. That was the first time a president got out and relished the crowds that were there to support him.
And he talks about at that time there was so much distrust in the government with coming off the Nixon administration, and they deliberately chose to get out of the vehicle and walk along this stretch to show the people that they were one of them, and that they could trust them. They could trust the Carters to represent the United States and run the government. So it's interesting to see the president succeeding that now, doing the same thing.
How about
something
that picture
that he set that precedent?
Saw a couple of seconds ago of everybody with their cell phones out?
Yeah.
Watching the processional go by?
They've been standing by, waiting in the cold and for this moment, Tom, waiting to see the incredible image of the casket draped with the U.S. flag on the caisson, marching down the road to get to the U.S. Capitol. So, sign of the times, seeing all the public holding up their cell phones, recording this moment, this historic moment, honoring the 39th President of the United States.
And so as we watch the honor processional arriving in front of the United States Capitol building, we've been regaled with incredible insight. We've been talking about Inauguration Day on that chilly day in Washington, D.C., when Jimmy Carter became the 39th President of the United States. Somebody who was there witnessing that firsthand and who was tapped to be the director of the Office of Management and Budget was Hubert Harris, who's been watching the coverage with us here and giving us extraordinary insight to the man, Jimmy Carter, and what that day, Mr. Harris, was like in Washington, D.C. when he took the oath of office. Just bring us into that moment, if you will. It was a chilly day. It was a sunny day, as you recall.
It was cold. I don't know whether it's as cold as it is today, but it was plenty cold. But the wind wasn't blowing, which made it easier. The walking down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House was not, no one that I know of knew in advance that was going to happen. It was an excellent way to do it, and I think it set a standard that others have followed since then. But it was a cold day. It was a glorious day from the standpoint of he was being inaugurated, would take over the government and do things the way he thought it ought to be done. It all began that day, and I thought it was a wonderful day, and I'm thankful I was there.
I was listening to an interview today from the son of Walter Mondale, who is going to be reading the eulogy that Jimmy Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, left behind to read for Jimmy Carter's funeral. Talk about the relationship that you were able to see those two had.
They were like two good friends. I didn't have any idea. I'd never met Senator Mondale before he was nominated for vice president, so I didn't have anything to go on other than what I heard. But I worked closely with him for 4 years and found him to be an outstanding individual who was a loyal supporter and helper of the president's, who was very willing to disagree when he didn't disagree on decision, or when he didn't agree with the president on decisions. And he was a person that had a great personality, great sense of humor, and could help take a tense situation and make it mild. So he was a great guy, and they had a great relationship, and I think set a standard for the way vice presidents and presidents work together since then.
Yeah, he's said to have really elevated the role of vice president, bringing Mondale into some of the most crucial decisions. You were the director of Office of Management and Budget. You were the person in charge of crafting the budgets that President Carter would introduce to Congress. You said that the president enjoyed a Democratic House and Senate, and so it was easier to pass legislation, but the president really didn't take that for granted. As we look at the Capitol building here, we're reminded of the mechanisms and the operations of government, and from a historical perspective, it's interesting to know how President Carter treated having that majority in Congress and passing legislation and budgets. He didn't take anything for granted.
Well, you couldn't take anything for granted when it comes to money, because that's the coin of the realm in Washington. I felt like that President Carter lived up to his reputation of being tight-fisted when it comes to spending, and not wasting money, and making sure that we get our efficiency factor up rather than stay as it was. So he did more than people realize in terms of changing things for the better, such as deregulation of the airline industry, deregulation of trucking, deregulation of rail, deregulation of the media industries.
Things that Democrats really aren't known to do.
But it's astounding how much we got done, but we couldn't have done it with Democrats alone. We were lucky enough to have a good relationship with many Republicans who supported our efforts when they agreed with us and joined with us. And so we oftentimes had a bipartisan vote for key legislation, or the key vote that shapes the legislation.
We've talked about how involved the Carters, Rosalind and Jimmy, were in this whole process once we came to this day when he passed. And he probably could have chosen anywhere where he would eventually want to be buried, whether it was even at the Carter Center in Atlanta or elsewhere. But he's choosing, we're seeing all of this pomp and circumstance and ceremonial, efforts behind this state funeral. But he's choosing to be buried in his hometown of Plains. What do you think that says about Mr. Carter?
He is a person of consistency. He's never left Plains, even though he lived in Washington for a while. He never really left Plains in his heart. And the people of Plains are the most wonderful people you could ever meet, and they have done a great job of putting together the Carter's activities for the last number of years. So I was not surprised when he said he'd be buried in Plains. In fact, I would have been surprised if he'd been buried anywhere else.
Do you think that after Carter suffered such a significant loss to Ronald Reagan, he channeled a lot of that a lot of the bruises that he received during that election in 1979 and 1980, channeled that into his efforts at the Carter Center and really remade himself, and really, for all intents and purposes, rewrote his legacy, not only for his presidency but his post-presidency. But do you think that if he had won another term, that we would have seen the post-presidency that Jimmy Carter manifested after he left Washington?
I don't know how to answer that, because it's be just guessing. He had many plans for a second term that would have solved a number of problems he felt like he couldn't take on for political reasons in the first term, and he would plan to take on the second term. So he had ideas and thoughts, and when he got beat, he went on back to Georgia and tried to figure out what to do. It came to him to create the Carter Center, which was actually opened, I think, about 1982. And its role and what it's done and its impact has just grown dramatically over time. And it was a forum for President Carter to focus on one of his primary goals in life, and that was to improve a lot of people's lives who were not being treated fairly by the government or by the countries they lived in, and worked things like guinea worm and other diseases to eradicate them. I mean, who takes on things like that?
Yeah.
And he's unique in that regard. So I'm proud to have been associated with him. I'm proud of what he's done, and I hope somebody comes along and tries to continue this type of a post-presidency.
Yeah, certainly Jason Carter, in his speech at the service at the Carter Center, really gave a call to action to some degree to the staff and members of the Carter Center, saying they now have this torch to continue this legacy and this global footprint that the Carter Center has certainly established. What do you think gave Jimmy Carter that audacity during that time to say there should be equal rights for everyone? Everyone should have access to good health, clean water. What do you think gave him that fortitude?
He didn't back off. Once he made a decision and a direction to go, he stayed with that decision. He was not political in any way when it came to major decisions. He thought human rights were something that had to be dealt with. He felt like in the South we had to change. If we didn't change, we'd never progress beyond where we were at the time. And he took a position there that was highly unpopular among some people, but was extremely popular with a lot of other people. So he didn't measure the political impact of it. He said, this is the right thing to do. This is the best thing to do for the whole population of the state. And therefore, this is where I'm going to point my direction. And he did.
We would be remiss if in all of this, not to mention the force and the power of Rosalind Carter, the wind beneath Jimmy Carter's wings, so to speak. Perhaps if there wasn't a Rosalind Carter, there wouldn't be a President Jimmy Carter. She was quite significant, not only in the president's life and his relationship with Rosalind, but what a force in his presidency as well. And being in the White House as you were, and working behind the scenes with Jimmy Carter in the Oval Office, and being privileged to see things that most of the American people never get to see. What was that political force like of these two individuals together?
Well, Rosalind was highly regarded by everyone. She was a person who spoke her piece when the time was right. She spoke her piece privately and publicly. She was very interested in mental health and in making mental health a treatment process similar to physical health, so that insurance covered it, employees who needed mental health services or their family could get it from their employment insurance program. So she did a lot in that regard, but she was his principal advisor. She's the last one to help him think about whatever the big decision was. She's also the one to tell him when he made a mistake, if he ever made one. I wouldn't admit that he did, but I'm sure he did. She was quick to help him make a good decision, and she was quick to help him undo a bad situation.
We're continuing to watch this procession, the horse-drawn carriage carrying the remains of the 39th President of the United States, President Jimmy Carter, followed by members of his family who are walking on the ground from what we understand. Some other members of the family are in vehicles behind them, so not every single family member who's been able to make this trip is walking on foot. Some of them are in the vehicles following them, and they will eventually get to the U.S. Capitol. We were saying it's about a half-mile distance between the Naval Academy and the Capitol building.
Yeah, some incredible insight by former Office of Management and Budget Director Hubert Harris. Insight into the Carter administration.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, for your time and
workings and the kind of man and president that Jimmy Carter was. This walk down Pennsylvania Avenue from the U.S. Navy Memorial is just a short distance. Probably feels longer in 32-degree weather.
Sure.
And as the sun is going down and it's only getting colder in our nation's capital, let's bring in Russ Spencer, who's out there braving the elements. And Russ, probably within earshot of a lot of this happening.
Yeah, I'm standing on the north side of the Capitol. I can look down from the building where I'm standing and see all of this and listen to the drum music and take it all in, and it is really quite a sight. I was listening to your conversation. You made an excellent point, Tom, about Rosalynn Carter's powerful relationship with the former president, not only as a spiritual duo for more than 77 years, but as a political one as well. And it made me think of Chip Carter on Saturday. Through tears, he says that Jimmy Carter was held up, propped up, and soothed by an amazing, amazing woman. And they absolutely were partners. And he said that marrying her was the most important and best decision he ever made. Going back to the Navy Memorial, we heard "Hail to the Chief," and not for the first time today. And I recalled having heard a story. Christine, you were talking about how he wanted to be a man of the people, and that was part of the reason why he decided to walk up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. Well, he didn't want "Hail to the Chief" to be played. He was mildly embarrassed by the fact that every time he walked into a room, that music was played, and said, "Come on, I don't need that." And his political advisors insisted, "Look, this is your due. You're the president of the United States, and this is how we do it." But his initial inclination was to not have that happen. And then that other piece of music at the Navy Memorial, "Just As I Am," some of you will remember that as the altar call for Billy Graham's revivals, a song that close to a lot of Southern Baptist hearts. As we watch this very solemn procession to the east side of the U.S. Capitol, the west side already prepared now for the inauguration of President Trump, President-elect Trump, a week from Monday. So it's a busy time in this part of Washington, D.C. The Capitol, as I'm looking at it, is surrounded by fencing, so security already very, very much in place. And a real hush of reverence over this city today as we say goodbye to the 39th President of the United States, and of course the only President of the United States to hail from the state of Georgia. Here very soon at the U.S. Capitol, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle will gather as a sign of political unity, out of respect for a life extraordinarily well lived. Politics set aside today, what people are honoring is a good man, a man who lived his faith. Every day was Sunday for him, in the sense that he was always striving to do what he thought God would want him to do. Obviously, there are differences of opinion when it comes to policy in this town, but there's not much difference of opinion that Jimmy Carter was a man of faith, and that he lived that faith for all those 100 years. At 7 o'clock tonight, people will have a chance to line up and begin to pay their respects. And I think it'll be interesting. I have no doubt. I heard, Christine, you mentioned 23,000 people made the procession and got a chance to learn a little bit more about Jimmy Carter's life by going through the Carter Center. It really is worth going if you haven't been. It'll give you even more appreciation for his life. And they'll have a chance to line up here at the U.S. Capitol beginning tonight at 7 for 5 hours, and then all day tomorrow before his body is taken to the National Cathedral on Thursday morning for the memorial service. Let's go back to our Tyler Fingert, who was at the Navy Memorial. That was quite a ceremony there, and Tyler, practically the entire Carter family was involved.
Yeah, Russ, good afternoon to you. You could hear a pin drop here as you heard every command from these officers, service members, as they did that dignified transfer from the hearse to the caisson that is now making its way to the U.S. Capitol. And you mentioned the Carter family. I mean, for me, the thing that sticks out in all of this is they're having to mourn in public. They are having to see everyone else as they are dealing with this loss. And I saw Jason Carter, along with many members of the Carter family, having their hand on their heart as they were in the process of doing that dignified transfer to the horse-drawn wagon that is now making its way to the Capitol. And so they're grieving in public. This is obviously a personal loss for them. Former President Jimmy Carter, 100 years old, a grandfather, a father, and for many of them, a great-grandfather as well. And so for many of them, this is a personal loss. But for this nation, he is a huge part of this country. He was our nation's 39th president, served 4 years in the White House, commander-in-chief, also served our country in the Navy for 15 years, both in active and in reserve. And it just obviously you can't take that for granted, because he is, as much as he is just a family man of God, he unfortunately also, or fortunately, he was shared with this country as president. And so this loss, obviously, for many people is a personal one, not just for the Carter family, but for Americans, as he is now making his way to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state, as you were mentioning, Russ. So this is a day where he is returning to Washington for the final time after passing away just within the last week and a half. And so this is something that he is getting all of his honors that he is due, being our former president and also being a veteran of the Navy. And so to just see how many people showed up for him. I mean, just beyond the Navy Memorial, there were actually, I think that's apartments or condos up there. We actually could see people out on their balconies, and then you also saw hundreds of people lining the streets coming out here. I mean, it is freezing for people who live here, 32 degrees right now, and people sat out here for probably about an hour or two just for that glimpse and being able to pay their respects to former President Jimmy Carter. And I'm sure many more are going to be going to the Capitol starting tonight at 7 o'clock to be able to go pay their respects to him in person under the Capitol Rotunda. And so it is truthfully, it was, to see that in person, I have never experienced anything like that. Just the pin drop, you could hear everyone just intently listening to this as he was had a dignified transfer from that hearse to that horse-drawn wagon that is now making its way to the Capitol. You're looking at those pictures right now as those service members are just preparing for his arrival. That short little about mile-long route, as Tom was mentioning just about 15 minutes ago, truly probably feels like an eternity in this freezing cold temperatures. And you can obviously just know that for many of these people, for many of these service members, this is an important chance to honor a former commander-in-chief for all he did for our country, this grateful nation, Russ.
Tyler, well said. It's the ultimate sign of respect as we look now at the east side of the U.S. Capitol. This is the side from which the public will enter into the Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects to the former president, again beginning at 7 o'clock tonight. But before that happens, he will lie in state in the presence of lawmakers, House and Senate lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, members of the Carter administration, and of course the Carter's extended family. Jason Carter now the chairman of the board of the Carter Center, as they continue their work. He says that his grandfather's life fills the spirit of that place, and his hope and expectation is that the work will continue to finally eradicate guinea worm, to eradicate river blindness in Central and South America, to look after the least of these. This sign of respect, the precision that goes into this military honor is really quite something. Let's listen. Washington D.C. and the temperature goes down as well, that there will be some sacrifice involved for the people who come to pay their respects to the 39th president. And I think that some of those folks might enjoy the fact that there's some sacrifice, knowing that sacrifice was a real part of Jimmy Carter's life, that humility was a big part of his life. So to come here tonight, on a night when it gets cold and it is windy, so the wind chill is probably 10 or 15 degrees colder than the temperature outside, to come out and show that kind of respect has a little more to it. Let's put it that way. There's some more commitment that goes into paying that kind of tribute to the president on a day like this. Tom and Christine, we have witnessed all day an extraordinary demonstration of how the U.S. military has respect and the tradition that they follow, the way they're able to lift up a former president this way and in the way that he ought to be celebrated.
Yeah, the pomp and pageantry, Russ, is so striking and remarkable to watch all of this unfold in the kind of precision that it does through the streets of the nation's capital, which are now no longer enjoying the light of the sunshine. Dusk is upon you up there, and you can see the streets underneath the horse-drawn carriage kind of freezing over as temperatures are expected to dip below freezing tonight as the late president makes his way up to the Capitol steps.
There was a shot from inside the Capitol Rotunda. We talk about the stillness that was felt outside the Naval Academy as the procession was in place. And you see inside the Rotunda the level of stillness before the remains of the 36th president arrive inside. Russ, I know you had a chance to talk to Senator Raphael Warnock. I don't know if he shared with you what he anticipates being able to be a part of this moment inside the Rotunda to witness the funeral service that will take place here.
Well, he said he wouldn't miss it for the world. Both he and Senator Ossoff plan to attend, as well as many Republicans will be in attendance as well, because they feel it's the only place to be this afternoon to show unity of purpose and showing respect to the former president. Senator Warnock made mention of how important he was in putting human rights and civil rights first and foremost in his administration. When it came to foreign policy, human rights were a leading light in his taking on of the Soviet Union. For example, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, he made a lot of people angry by boycotting the Olympics, but he felt like it was the thing to do because human rights to him were that important. There's so much to celebrate about former President Jimmy Carter's administration. Perhaps first and foremost, the 13 days that he spent at Camp David with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begum that resulted in the Camp David Accords. That is a peace treaty that still is in effect today. There is peace between Israel and Egypt today, and try to imagine what the Middle East would be like without that. And that was certainly one of his proudest accomplishments when he was in office. But there are so many that you discussed with Mr. Harris. Deregulation of the airline industry, deregulation of transportation, generally speaking, even the craft beer industry. People don't realize he was sort of set the legal framework for that to happen. There are so many things to celebrate, but primarily I think today they're celebrating a man of faith. And this is what Senator Warnock said, that he thinks of him as a man of faith who lived out his faith on a daily basis. I had a conversation with Andrew Young, the former Atlanta mayor, and before that, UN ambassador to the United Nations, the first African American to serve in that role. And he put it to me this way. He said he felt like Jimmy Carter's life was a ministry, that he did what he thought was right and let the politics take care of itself. And you know, the politics really didn't take care of itself when it came to 1980, and he was certainly disappointed in that result. Some in the family, Jason has said that even the former president himself acknowledged that perhaps Rosalind was the more political animal of the two, and that she suggested to him, for example, and this is an issue we hear about in the news today, she suggested to him that perhaps they not do the Panama Canal Treaty until his second term because it was politically unpopular. But he felt that it was the right thing to do, and that's why they did it. So all of this pomp and circumstance, all of this respect and reverence is for a man who almost everyone acknowledges did at least what he thought was the correct thing to do in the moment. And to do that for 100 years is quite something.
Yeah, there was a story, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, Russ, as we await the remains of President Carter to move into the Capitol Rotunda up the steps there, of when he first met Andrew Young and when he was a state official here, the late president. It was at a lunch, I believe, and Young wasn't that enthused to meet and greet Carter until he learned of Carter's civil rights bona fides from some of his relationships in Plains. And only at that time did Young agree to meet Carter and sort of learn more about him and his stand on civil rights, which at the time went against many here in our own state of Georgia.
And it's quite remarkable to learn that Jimmy Carter never even met Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
There was a relationship, and Rusty spoke to that earlier, that the elder King knew Jimmy Carter, but he never met MLK Jr.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you talk about Jimmy Carter's involvement in Africa, fighting guinea worm and other diseases. He was the first U.S. president to be born in a hospital. But then they moved from Plains to Archery a couple of miles away to the family farm, and he did not have running water or electricity in his house until he was in his teens. And that gave him an appreciation for how difficult it can be to be poor and not have people take care of you. There were people in his immediate environment as a young person who suffered from gastrointestinal diseases, and that was part of his inspiration, having grown up so humbly, to take care of the least of these for the 44 years of his life after the presidency, and certainly he kept them foremost in his mind during his presidency as well.
Well, now we're looking at the schedule that is a little bit behind here. The service is supposed to begin at the Capitol Rotunda at 4:30, but we see the casket here parked right in front of the U.S. Capitol. Military team will take the casket off the caisson and march to the top of the steps of the Capitol Rotunda before entering the inside, where lawmakers are standing by as we speak, getting ready to start that service very shortly.
It's worth noting that, as we heard from one of the late president's own cabinet members, that Carter was not a creature of the Washington establishment. In many ways, like his successor, Ronald Reagan, the two shared that in common, and that the late president oftentimes went against conventional wisdom in terms of some of the policies that he was able to push through the building that you see there, enjoying a Democratic House and Senate, but not necessarily passing some of the policies that would be uniformly approved by Democrats, and needing Republican participation in passing some of that legislation, sort of underscoring the bipartisan nature through which Carter tried to govern as president.
It was important that he reached across the aisle, right? And Mr. Harris talked about the relationships that had to be built with Republicans to get some of the legislation passed that they were successfully able to do during Carter's term. As we await now during this moment here, a military body bearer team will eventually get to this caisson and make its way up the Capitol steps, and we see flags flying at half-staff above the Capitol there. President Biden putting into effect that the flags will fly at half-staff for 30 days from his death. So until January 28th, we will see flags ordered at half-staff until that time.
And the government will close essentially on Thursday, the day of President Carter's funeral at the National Cathedral there in Washington, D.C. And in attendance for this ceremony will be the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. As Russ mentioned, a bipartisan delegation of members of Congress, the Supreme Court, the governors of the governor and the mayor of Washington, D.C., and some of the cabinet members and diplomatic corps will join the Joint Chiefs of Staff in this ceremony inside the Capitol Rotunda. In one of the shots, we're able to see our senators, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff there, front row, waiting to greet the remains of President Carter. You can just catch a glimpse of Warnock there on the far left-hand side of your screen. Next to him, John Ossoff, as members of the congressional delegation await the arrival of the former president.
And, we shouldn't be surprised to see this bipartisan effort, this moment legislators are taking to respectfully recognize someone who served our country honorably in the military and served our country honorably as president. We're starting to see a little bit of movement here now as a team from the military, it appears, begins to make their way here to the caisson and eventually move the caisson off the wagon, or move the casket off the wagon and up several steps. I look at those steps and the movements that it will take to go up that incline to get to the very top. It's with precision. It's very choreographed.
It's funny, we see former presidents on Inauguration Day come down those steps to board Marine One.
Yes, that's right.
To leave Washington after the conclusion of their administrations. The same thing will happen in just 2 weeks. This will be the scene playing out as Joe Biden walks down those steps to conclude his presidency. We understand that Senator John Thune, the majority leader in the United States Senate, House Speaker Mike Johnson, and the Vice President will deliver eulogies and lay wreaths during this service. And some of those hymns that we've been hearing all day, which have been such a profound part of this day, reflecting the faith, the deep faith held by Jimmy Carter, will be played, and it will include an invocation from the chaplain of the United States Senate. All of that supposed to get underway at 4:30, but we're running about 10 to 15 minutes behind schedule here.
These, if we're reading the sequence of events properly here, these steps lead up to the east doors of the Capitol. And again, just so befitting of someone who served this country honorably, humbly, came from humble beginnings, and seeing this level of attention being given to President Carter. I'm sure his family is feeling very proud of the a level of effort people have been putting in to make sure they witness this moment as well.
Russ Spencer, who's leading our coverage from Washington, D.C., who's there as all of this happens. Russ, looking ahead to the National Cathedral ceremony, we will have representatives from government, former presidents. I believe the president-elect will also be there in attendance at the National Cathedral. Give us a little bit of information on how Thursday is going to play out.
Well, that's my understanding as well, Tom, that former President Trump, President-elect Trump, will be in attendance. President Biden will deliver one of the eulogies. I believe that Jason Carter will speak as well. That will happen early in the morning on Thursday. His body the casket will be moved from here to the National Cathedral, which is just a few miles in that direction, north and west of the White House. It's going to be a jam-packed day on Thursday for the Carter family, because after that, the former president's body will be flown to Southwest Georgia. He will be taken to planes. There will be a private service at Maranatha Baptist Church where he taught Sunday school, and then he will be laid to rest all in the same day as this service here at the National Cathedral. He'll be laid to rest next to his beloved Rosalind by the willow tree, a place that they chose together, finally reunited after all this time. You know, you can't overstate how much preparation has gone into today, and you can see it since it's all unfolding in such a precise and loving and reverent way. But we at Fox 5 have been in communication with the Carter Center for years and years, perhaps as long as a decade, about these plans. You'll recall that at one time the former president had melanoma that got to his brain, was treated for that, ultimately said to be cancer-free. I mean, the man was bulletproof for a long, long time, went into hospice 23 months ago, and the family thought that they were near the end. And then, of course, his beloved Rosalind passed away in November of last year, some 13, 14 months ago now, just before Thanksgiving. And he was able to come to the service at Emory University, but he looked frail. And I think that all of us wondered then, well, he lived long enough to see Rosalind pass. Now will be the time. And I think Jason felt that way too. We'd had a conversation about that. And yet he hung on for more than a year. And then, of course, this fall, I'm not sure How much of this was just part of the lore of the moment, but the family said that he was hanging on long enough to cast a vote for Kamala Harris, and he did live long enough to do that. So here we are in a moment that is truly apolitical. As you point out, the Senate Majority Leader Thune, who has recently taken over now, just taken over from Mitch McConnell, who was in that leadership role for a long, long time, and the House Speaker Mike Johnson, who was recently reelected by one vote. They are going to show their respect to President Jimmy Carter, a one-term Democrat from a long, long time ago. And you two were pointing out how he was not a creature of Washington, as many who preceded him were. Of course, Richard Nixon had been a senator and vice president to Dwight David Eisenhower. Before him, Lyndon Johnson was a creature of the Senate, a Senate leader, and knew all about how to schmooze and count the votes and all that sort of thing. Jimmy Carter, by all accounts, by his own account, did not like to schmooze. He liked to. He was an engineer. He dealt with facts. This is how I see it. This is how it ought to be. Now, I'm not saying that he was a my way or the highway kind of person, but the horse trading was not what he came to Washington to do. He came to Washington to get things done, and got a lot done in 4 years. But from a political standpoint, may have paid a price for it. Some of that reward is happening today, and the respect that he has garnered in the last decades. As people take a second look at his presidency, it has been pointed out that his post-presidency is more widely respected, I think it's fair to say, than the 4 years that he had in office. But I think some of that's being reassessed as well, that there was more accomplishment, and that some of the circumstances in the late 1970s, the energy crisis, the hostage crisis with Iran, some of that was out of the president's hands, and inflation was terrible at the moment, and he chose Paul Volcker for the Fed, knowing that Volcker would raise interest rates and that would hurt his chance for re-election, and he did it anyway. There are myriad stories just like that where Jimmy Carter did what he thought was right and paid a political price for it, which includes his support of civil and human rights around the world. Some of that was unpopular in our own state when he made that declaration in 1971 during his inauguration that the time for racial discrimination is over. Some of those who had voted for him didn't think he was going to say that at his inauguration, and he did. And history has proven him to be on the right side of things as far as that was concerned.
Yeah, Washington was certainly a different place in so many ways in the late 1970s when Carter assumed the presidency. We were coming out of just a very dark chapter in American politics in the wake of the Watergate scandal, and it sort of gave wind, I suppose, in one regard or another, to the appeal or the allure of an outsider and a humble man from Georgia to captivate the attention of the nation and to come into office as not a creature of Washington like we've been talking about, but an outsider with a more humble background, upbringing, personal life story, to come in such a volatile time in our nation's history, both politically and economically and geopolitically, with events happening around the world that affected the pockets of everyday Americans in terms of waiting in gas lines at the time. I recall doing that with my parents in our station wagon. It was just a sign of the times, and many of these things wound up consuming the Carter presidency.
Yeah, and you know, the Carter presidency, for a lot of people before he ran, was a long shot. when he was governor of Georgia and expressed interest in running for the president, people thought he wouldn't have a lot of success outside the state of Georgia because his name wasn't as known. The stories told about him as governor telling his mother that he'd like to run for president, and she said, "President of what?" Yeah. Because even she didn't even think that big that he could successfully run for president of the United States. But with, the prenup brigade, as they called them, they went out and they stumped and campaigned for him across the country, and he made history, becoming the first person from Georgia to run for president and be president of the United States. So in a lot of ways, he accomplished many things to be proud of.
We're seeing some movement here.
I mean, just that he could.
Go ahead,
I'm
Ross.
sorry. I was just going to add that just that he could say with a straight face, "I will never knowingly lie to you," and that resonated back in the 1970s, as you point out, after the Watergate scandal. That very simple declaration, meant a lot, and I haven't heard anybody suggest that they think that he didn't hold up his end of the bargain as far as that was concerned.
Yeah, and he had that folksy grin, the cardigan sweaters, the creature comforts that many Americans could relate to in their own ways. Didn't seem too distant from the lives that they were living. Told us to turn the heat down at night to conserve energy. Not many people were thrilled with that, but trying to do things as relatable as possible to confront the situations that were in front of him, and was always sort of in touch with the struggles of the American people. We are seeing some movement here at the base of the steps of the Capitol, presuming that the casket will be brought up to the Rotunda at any moment now.
When this service begins inside the Rotunda, we will first hear from the chaplain of the U.S. Senate, who will be giving the invocation, and then the eulogies will follow from there. We'll hear first from the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who will give the first eulogy, and then the Speaker of the Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate, rather, will give the first eulogy, and then we'll hear from Speaker Mike Johnson, and then Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. From there, we'll hear from the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club, who will play "My Country 'Tis of Thee." And then Mike Johnson and Speaker Thune and Vice President Harris will return again and place wreaths by the casket, holding the remains of President Carter. And then we'll hear from the Glee Club again, playing "Eternal Father, Strong to Save," which is a Navy hymn, and then it will be followed by the benediction from the chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives, as we see now some members of the Carter family, his son Chip Carter there, along with others, coming out of the entrance of the U.S. Capitol from the top of the steps. So they will watch from the top of the steps the body of their patriarch inside the casket, draped by a American flag, step by step make its way to the top of the Capitol steps.
Yeah, this is quite a moment. We were talking about what a busy schedule, so to speak, that the Carter family is going to have over the next couple of days, memorializing their brother, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, the man who meant so much to that family in a much more personal way than he meant to the rest of us, which will all culminate down in Plains on Thursday in that private burial service next to Rosalind, where they will also be in attendance. That will follow the funeral service at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., which will be attended by all of the former presidents and the president-elect, President Trump. at the conclusion of this ceremony, at about 6 p.m., although I'm guessing it's going to happen a little bit later, Carter will lie in state while the military maintains a guard of honor, and then the public will be invited to file through the Capitol to pay their respects from 6 p.m. until midnight tonight.
Yeah, not nearly as long as what folks here in Georgia were able to take part in. And let's listen in as this procession and service begins.
Ready, step. 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 Forward, march.
Yeah.
right, and we're watching the feed from inside the Rotunda where it is fully silent. You can hear a pin drop at this point, and we're seeing not only members of the General Congress, but we're also seeing Supreme Court justices.
So
in
many
attendance as
luminaries,
well.
yeah, in attendance. The Vice President Kamala Harris there walking in. The new Senate Majority Leader John Thune, House Speaker Mike. So
In
many
attendance as
luminaries,
well.
yeah, in attendance. The Vice President Kamala Harris there walking in. The new Senate Majority Leader John Thune, House Speaker Mike Johnson, the husband of Kamala Harris, in attendance as well. That looks like Brett Kavanaugh standing behind the Vice President, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. We saw the D.C. Mayor a couple of moments ago, Muriel Bowser. We saw our own Senate delegation there, former Senate Majority Leader, now Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, standing there now.
Hakeem Jeffries next to him, so everybody getting in position, just a sign that we are getting closer to beginning the service, and the Capitol Rotunda receiving the remains of the 39th President of the United States, President Carter. What a sight to see so many there in the Rotunda in full silence as they wait.
And there's Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan next to Brett Kavanaugh, so a bipartisan delegation, so to speak, from the United States Supreme Court as members of the armed services file into the Rotunda. We saw the Carter family a couple of moments ago greet the casket of former President Jimmy Carter and escort his remains into the building.
With their hands over their hearts, some of them, as they watch their patriarch come to the building where I'm sure many deals and conversations were made. Let's listen in.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms have bound the restless waves, we thank you for the inspiration of a consequential and laudable life as we celebrate the legacy of James Earl Carter, Jr., the 39th President of the United States. We proclaim your generosity to this nation and world for giving us the gift of someone with the ethical congruence to be salt and light to his generation. Lord, he made the world more palatable. We thank you for his passion for integrity, his commitment to leave the world better than he found it, and his exemplary love for his precious Rosalind. Inspired by his great life, teach us to know you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. We pray in your matchless name. Amen.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and other members of the Carter family, and distinguished guests. Today we gather to begin a final farewell to Jimmy Carter, Navy veteran, peanut farmer, Governor of Georgia, and President of the United States. Sunday school teacher, Nobel Prize winner, advocate for peace and human rights, and first and foremost, a faithful servant of his Creator and his fellow man. In a commencement speech he delivered at Liberty University back in 2018, President Carter told a story about going on a mission to Massachusetts back in his younger days under the auspices of the Southern Baptist Convention. During that trip, President Carter was impressed by the success of a fellow missionary in winning souls to Christ. And so as the mission was winding down, he asked him what made him so successful. He was a little embarrassed by my question, President Carter recalled, but then he finally said, I try to have two loves in my heart. One love is for God, and the other love I have in my heart is for the person who happens to be in front of me at any particular time. It was a statement President Carter said that he never forgot. And I think it's fair to say that it's also a statement he lived by. President Carter's term as president ended in 1981. And for the remainder of his life, the longest post-presidency of any American president ever, he focused on making the lives of his fellow men better. That meant things like the Carter Center, which among other things works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. And it meant things like his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And when I say his work with Habitat for Humanity, I do mean his work. Jimmy Carter knew that his status as a former president could bring attention to good causes. It's why he encouraged Habitat to make use of his name and image. But simply lending his name, or maybe attending a gala or two, wasn't Jimmy Carter's style. He was here to get down in the weeds and the dirt, And he did that literally on numerous habitat builds, including one back in 1994 in Eagle Butte in my home state of South Dakota. Well into his 90s, he could be found with his hard hat and tools on construction sites doing the practical work required to get families into homes. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jimmy Carter did his very best to live according to the calling of his Lord and Savior. Today I join all Americans in mourning President Carter and remembering his example. But I rejoice in the thought that he, together with his beloved wife, Rosalind, is now before the face of his Father.
To the family, to Jack and Chip and Jeff and Amy, the entire Carter family, Vice President Harris, members of the Cabinet, Leader Thune, my colleagues in Congress, and my fellow citizens. We meet in this sacred hall of self-government to honor an extraordinary man, a man who modeled the virtues of service and citizenship as well as any other American. Surrounding us are the statues of those who gave their time, their energy, and their lives for the good of America. Before us lays a man who now joins their midst as a patriot, a veteran, a humanitarian, and the 39th President of the United States. When Jimmy Carter walked out on the east front of the Capitol and took his oath of office, I was just 4 years old, and he's the first president that I remember. Looking back, it's obvious now to me as an adult why he captured everyone's attention. Jimmy Carter was a member of the greatest generation. He lived through the Great Depression. He did that on a farm in rural Georgia. He knew the value of a dollar, and he modeled thrift his entire life. As long as he was in office, he hated government waste. His father, an Army veteran of the World War I era, taught patriotism to his children. And eventually his son, this young man from Plains, followed his father's example of self-sacrifice, and he joined the Naval Academy in the middle of World War II. In the Army, Lieutenant Carter learned from the legendary Admiral Rickover to always do his best as he served on the first fleet of nuclear submarines. It's telling that today the USS Jimmy Carter, a top-secret attack submarine, now roams the oceans bearing the name of the only president who served in such close quarters. President Carter's life, his selfless service, his fight against cancer, and his lasting contributions to his fellow man are all truly remarkable. Whether he was in the White House or in his post-presidential years, as was discussed, President Carter was willing to roll up his own sleeves to serve and get the job done. We all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, and that was mentioned. And the origin story goes that it was in 1984, when he first became aware of the work. He was in New York for a friend's anniversary. Millard Fuller, the founder of the fledgling charity at the time, called President Carter and asked if he wanted to visit a site in Brooklyn during his trip. President Carter agreed, and he found his way down to the Lower East Side. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, he looked out on the wealth of Wall Street to the south and to the power of Midtown Manhattan to the north. And then he looked down, and he saw an image he'd never forget. An elderly woman cooking breakfast over an open fire in the rubble of the building, there in the heart of the richest city in the world. The Habitat for Humanity worker that was there with him turned to President Carter and said, if there's anything that you can do, we would take it. He said, if there's anything I can do, let me know. The worker said, well, maybe you can send some volunteer carpenters from your church. It was the very next day that President Carter called Habitat for Humanity and told them he was going to send some carpenters, all right, and that he himself would be one of them. And thus began his famous tradition of donating 1 week every year to build and restore homes for his fellow Americans. It's remarkable to think that one of the 45 men who has served as president and one of the only 13 who held the role in the nuclear age would humble himself to such service. We all know that his care for humanity didn't stop at building homes. In the face of illness, President Jimmy Carter brought life-saving medicine. In the face of conflict, he brokered peace. In the face of discrimination, he reminded us that we are all made in the image of God. And if you were to ask him why he did it all, he would likely point to his faith. I'm reminded of his admonition to, quote, live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon, and of his amazing personal reflection. Quote, if I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. We all agree that he certainly did. So today in these hallowed halls of our republic, we honor President Carter, his family, and his enduring legacy that he leaves, not only upon this nation, but upon the world.
Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, members of Congress, and distinguished guests. It is an honor to be with you this afternoon, and to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and Jason, and all the other members of the Carter family. On behalf of the American people, Doug and I offer our deepest condolences. Being with you today, I'm reminded of the enduring words of a favorite hymn. May the works I have done speak for me. Today we gather to celebrate the life of a man whose works will echo for generations to come. A man from Plains, Georgia, who grew up without electricity or running water, and served as the 39th President of the United States of America, and lived every day of his long life in service to the people. President James Earl Carter, Jr. So I was in middle school when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and I vividly recall how my mother admired him, how much she admired his strength of character, his honesty, his integrity, his work ethic and determination, his intelligence, and his generosity of spirit. We have heard much today and in recent days about President Carter's impact in the 4 decades after he left the White House. Rightly so. Jimmy Carter established a new model for what it means to be a former president, and leaves an extraordinary post-presidential legacy. From founding the Carter Center, which has helped advance global human rights and alleviate human suffering, to his public health work in Latin America and Africa, to his tireless advocacy for peace and democracy around the globe. And Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States who was ahead of his time. He was the first President of the United States to have a comprehensive energy policy, including providing some of the first federal support for clean energy. He also passed over a dozen major pieces of legislation regarding environmental protection, and more than doubled the size of America's national parks, including protecting our beloved redwoods in my home state of California. He was a president who, between the years of 1977 and 1981, appointed more Black Americans to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined, and appointed 5 times as many women. And in the wake of Watergate, Jimmy Carter passed historic ethics legislation to help rebuild America's faith in government. Jimmy Carter, as president, was also a respected global leader. To be sure, the years of his presidency were not without international crises or challenges, but his legacy of global leadership is well established. In Asia, he instituted full diplomatic relations with China, which he would later call one of the most historically significant accomplishments of his presidency. And his legacy lives on in the Middle East because, do recall, in the decades before Jimmy Carter became president, Israel and Egypt had been at war numerous times. Few thought peace could be achieved between them. Yet Jimmy Carter did that. Through his persistence and perseverance, through his unshakable belief in the power of American diplomacy, he secured the Camp David Accords, one of the most significant and durable peace treaties since World War II. And throughout the world, Jimmy Carter elevated the role of human rights in America's foreign policy priorities and uplifted the importance of civil society in doing that work. Jimmy Carter was a forward-looking president with a vision for the future. Consider his establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977, which anticipated the central role it would play in addressing the climate crisis. His creation of FEMA in 1979, which enabled our nation to mobilize a national response to disasters, which has helped countless communities rebuild and recover. And his founding of the Department of Education later that year, which elevated public education institutions and increased national standards for the education of America's children and future leaders. Jimmy Carter was that all too rare example of a gifted man who also walks with humility, modesty, and grace. Recall the stories from the 1976 campaign about how he slept in the homes of his supporters to share a meal with them at their table and to listen to what was on their minds. How on their first trip for Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy and Rosalind rode the bus with the other volunteers. And when the group stopped for the night to stay at a local church, Jimmy and Rosalind gave their private room to a young couple who had put off their honeymoon to join the trip. And with the other volunteers, they then slept on the floor of the church basement. And then, of course, his work to eradicate the vicious guinea worm disease that once disabled millions of people a year. It was one of the Carter Center's greatest triumphs. And Jimmy Carter, of course, given his nature, attributed its success not to his own leadership, but to the thousands of everyday Africans who were on the ground doing the work. Throughout his life and career, Jimmy Carter retained a fundamental decency and humility. James Earl Carter Jr. loved our country. He lived his faith, he served the people, and he left the world better than he found it. And in the end, Jimmy Carter's work and those works speak for him, louder than any tribute we can offer. May his life be a lesson for the ages and a beacon for the future. May God bless President Jimmy Carter, and may God bless the United States of America.
Life
Would you pray with me? Holy and loving God, receive into your eternal joy your good and faithful servant, James Earl Carter, Jr. Reward him richly and grant him your own well done for his humble and honorable life, worth far more than the many accolades and attributions we have gladly given. May President Jimmy Carter now rest from his labors and be received into the embrace of your everlasting arms. And when the ceremony and fanfare due this man of character and compassion fades into history, when the processions and parades have dispersed, leave with us, O God, the lasting impression and inspiration of a life well lived. Ignite in us the same passion for public service, the courage to champion the underserved, the strength to bear as faithfully the weight of the call to which you have called each one of us, to do as justly, to love mercy as unreservedly, to walk as humbly with you as we have witnessed in the testimony of President Jimmy Carter's life of faithfulness. We offer our prayers in the name of the one whom Jimmy Carter would have known to be the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, his rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
We are watching the family now of President Carter as they file past the casket inside the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. Some of their faces, the most emotional I've seen. Some of them, Amy, looked a bit emotional as she reached out and touched the casket, the youngest daughter of Jimmy Carter, before filing by. And as we have been saying, dozens of members of the Carter family traveled from Georgia to be here today for the service that just concluded inside the Rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. Lasted about, we'd say about 40 or so minutes, and heard from multiple speakers who gave beautiful eulogies of the president.
Yeah, the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club performing beautiful renditions. The final, Strong to Save. The Senate Majority Leader John Thune and House Speaker Mike Johnson both speaking. Vice President Kamala Harris, also seemingly moved, told some anecdotes of President Carter there, Vice President Harris and Doug Emhoff, her husband, approaching the casket, and Senate Majority Leader John Thune, House Speaker Mike Johnson there in attendance, Senate and House leadership, bipartisan delegations from both chambers of the United States Congress, in addition to Supreme Court members. A couple of things as we bring in Fox 5 anchor Russ Spencer, who is leading our coverage in Washington, D.C. Russ, Kamala Harris saying that Jimmy Carter slept in the homes of supporters as he ran for president, and rode in buses along during the campaign. Just a humble man to the core. Some very moving eulogies delivered there at the United States Capitol.
Really, an extraordinarily humble man before he became president, while he was president, and in the 4.5 decades after the fact. I just found it incredibly moving to watch the family approach the casket and touch it in such a personal way after seeing the precision of the U.S. military all day, out of total respect, of course, but the juxtaposition of just how personal and emotional the family was really quite something to witness. And I was really taken by the bipartisanship that we saw today that you mentioned, Tom. And we had the new Senate Majority Leader, Republican John Thune, who spoke about his work with Habitat Humanity, gave him credit not just for showing up for the photo op, but for actually doing the work, and mentioned something that I thought was very touching, that Jimmy Carter was on a mission, and asked someone who he thought was particularly effective what his secret was, and the man told Jimmy a story that Jimmy repeated later in his life, saying, I love two things. I try to love two things, God and the person who's standing right in front of me at any given moment. House Speaker Mike Johnson, also a Republican, of course, had another Christian reference. He said, live your life as if Christ is coming this afternoon, because that's what Jimmy Carter did. So really quite a very moving ceremony, a very personal ceremony this afternoon.
Yeah, they spoke to Jimmy Carter's character, to his honesty, to his integrity, to his work ethic, to his generosity of spirit, and the chaplain concluding with really a beautiful prayer expressing Jimmy Carter as a good and faithful servant, and that he's now resting in the arms of Christ. Russ, we appreciate your coverage there from a very cold Washington, D.C. Our Tyler Fingert also is part of our coverage today, and that will continue into the evening here.
Very fitting beginning to a two-day series of remembrances for former President Jimmy Carter in our nation's capital there, which will culminate at the National Cathedral on Thursday before he returns home to his beloved plains. Thanks so much for joining us for our special coverage.
Yeah, we will continue our coverage after this break. Fox 5 News at 5 will continue.
you.